Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share with all of you some of what we've learned about siblings. And even though there is still so much need, there's so much that we don't know about siblings, the research has really grown quite a bit over the past 10 years. So I'm going to start very broad with sort of general findings of what we know about siblings as a population, and then try to get a little more specific in talking about what are some of these individual differences. Now, we know that every family is different. Everybody knows this. So there might very well be multiple points throughout my presentation that you find yourself thinking, that doesn't sound anything like the sibling that I know or the sibling I am, and that is absolutely fine. I'm going to try to keep reminding everybody that the experiences and the findings that we show do not necessarily apply to everybody, but they do tell us quite valuable things about the sibling experience in general. And then again, I'll have time for more specific questions at the end. So because I am a researcher, I am going to present mostly studies. So these are results from samples that may or may not resemble exactly what you and your child and your sibling and the families that you work with have experienced. But then near the end, I am going to share some specific examples from families and sibs that I've worked with over the years. But I'm going to start with going over a general model. Now, this might look a little overwhelming, but keep in mind that any time we try to do research on human beings, there's going to be so much that impacts one individual human's experience. So some of my colleagues over in the UK developed this model to help us keep in mind all of the things that we need to at least consider, if not explicitly measure, when we're thinking about sibling outcomes. So all of these things are going to influence in one way or another each individual sibling. So as researchers and as clinicians, siblings, like any other population, aren't just at our beck and call. We don't just get to snap our fingers and say, hey, we need 3,000 siblings to take this survey for us. So we're going to have limited samples. So when we get the results that I'm going to talk about in a minute, we need to remember that these results exist within the context of this kind of model. So we start within the sibling, that sort of central box, that demographics make a difference. So age, gender, personal interpretation, so coping skills come into play, their individual setting. In terms of demographics for siblings of individuals with disabilities in general, we know that the oldest female sibling tends to be the one that takes on the most caregiving responsibility across the lifespan. Again, that doesn't apply to everybody, but on average, that's what happens. This is also where the broader autism phenotype would be applied, this within sibling. So the individual characteristics of the sibling. We hear a lot about genetics when it comes to autism, and they're certainly not deterministic, nor are they necessarily the most important thing, but these all matter in the big additive structure of sibling outcomes. So then we have the systems, if we move out another box, that siblings directly interact with. So their family. Even though we're talking about siblings today and I study siblings, siblings exist in a structure. So their family matters, their family situation matters, the things that happen to their family matters. And then we move a little further out to the exosystem and the macrosystem. And these are things like culture, societal influences. We know, even though things are slowly getting better, that our society still isn't set up for people with autism. And that can make it very challenging, certainly for the individuals themselves, but also for the family and the siblings. And then finally, this dotted line along the top and the outside shows how this isn't necessarily a linear process. It's not, okay, these things happen, they combine with these variables, and you get a single outcome. Well, no, that outcome, be it stress, be it social skills, that then feeds back into the system, and these things continue to interact over time. So as I talk about research outcomes, I'd like you to try to keep in mind that these outcomes exist within, like every other human experience, a fairly complicated system. So when we talk about existing sibling research, there's, again, like I said, there's been more over the course of the past decade, 15 years, but still when you search autism siblings, you find a lot of the baby sib studies. So tracking younger infant siblings of individuals who have an autism diagnosis to see if and how that sibling themselves may or may not develop autistic traits. These are valuable studies. We get a lot of information, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about the experience of the sibling. So there are the baby sib studies, and that still represents, I'd say, a majority of sibling studies, at least a plurality. And then among the studies of siblings who do not have an autism diagnosis, you see the phrase findings are mixed. You see this all the time. Well, that's because it's true. Some studies find that siblings have more negative outcomes than siblings of individuals without autism. Some don't find any more negative outcomes. Some studies find more positive outcomes, such as helping behavior. So how do we make sense of all of these different studies? It's also worth noting at this point that many sibling studies do have fairly small sample sizes, and obviously this is something that Spark is trying to address in building a really large database. But it can be challenging to get siblings to participate in studies and to get parents to encourage siblings to participate, because it's not necessarily something that's going to have immediate beneficial outcome. It's just helping us as scientists and clinicians understand the sibling experience better. So with that in mind, that there are all these studies and they have all these different outcomes, the first single study that I'm going to talk about isn't a single study at all. It's a meta-analysis. So a combination of all of the sibling studies that we could find that have a comparison group. So this sort of big question of, do siblings of individuals with autism struggle? Do they have it worse? Do they have it better? Are they the same? So my colleagues and I put together this meta-analysis, statistically, mathematically combining the literature to see, okay, on average, are typically developing siblings of individuals with autism more or less likely or no different to have different social, emotional, psychological, or behavioral outcomes? Now, we kept this study to sort of the social, emotional, behavioral outcomes rather than cognitive outcomes, so the more school performance perhaps, because those outcomes, the cognitive outcomes, tend to get mixed up in the risk studies. So is this sibling at higher risk for autism? Now, before we get to the official results, I want to be clear that these are just looking at outcomes. So we don't know exactly what's causing these differences. And most specifically, and this is so important, I am in no way saying that the child with autism, the brother or sister with autism, is at fault here, that they are somehow causing the sibling to have different outcomes. That's not it. We all know that brothers and sisters can be irritating and frustrating. That's a universal thing. I have 8 brothers and sisters. It happens with everybody. But what I want to make clear here, and please keep this in mind when I talk about these results, is that this is not an individual thing. This isn't, oh, there's a child with autism, that child is making things harder on the family. This is a societal issue. So like I said, society is not set up for people with autism. There are barriers, challenges, stigma. And we all know this. So society makes things hard on the individual with autism, and then that individual with autism may react in certain ways and may have challenges, and that makes things hard for the entire family. So I know a lot of these studies and the language can end up sounding anti-autism, and I want to make very clear that that is not the point here. By studying siblings and the factors that influence siblings, I'm really looking at how these individuals and their families fit into society. All right, so a quick explanation. There will not be a quiz on statistical procedures, but a meta-analysis is a statistical synthesis of existing numeric results. So in order to combine everything, all of these studies that we included had to have a comparison group. So they're comparing siblings of individuals with autism to some other group. And then we combine those to create an effect size called a Hedges G that is calculated for each study and then numerically combined for one overall effect size. Again, you don't have to know all this, but I'm a big stats geek and I think it's great fun. All right. So this is just a table, a figure showing how many studies we looked at and then how many we ended up with. So if you Google, looking at these Web of Science, PsycInfo, EBSCOhost, and you search for siblings and autism, you get over 1,000 studies from each source. So we looked at these studies, we reviewed articles, and ended up with 69 separate studies. Now, each of these studies could have multiple variables, multiple things that they looked at, but this actually isn't that bad of a size for a meta-analysis considering how little sibling research was done even 20 years ago. All right, so in terms of these outcomes, what did each study measure? A lot of different things. My colleagues and I had to do a lot of work in combining these different outcomes into salient categories. So both behavior problems and psychological functioning, we further broke those down, and I'll explain that on the next slide. But a lot of these variables meant different things based on the individual study. So the way we categorized all these outcomes were adjustment, which had to do with school performance, stress, adaptability, general well-being. This was kind of a catch-all category. Moving further down, beliefs could be both beliefs about self, so self-esteem, life satisfaction, but then also beliefs about the world. So optimism, pessimism, and then also beliefs about disability. So siblings of individuals with autism, what do they think about disability and individuals with disability in general? And then the other one I'll explain is family functioning. So this is looking at their relationship, usually with their parents. And then the sibling relationship is a separate category. The moderators are additional variables that were measured and controlled for. So the comparison group, are we comparing siblings to siblings of individuals without autism, siblings of individuals with Down syndrome? Who was the reporter? Was it the parent? Was it the sibling themselves? Was it a teacher? We also looked at sample age, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Nationality, were these studies conducted in the United States, in another country, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia? The report status, was this a dissertation or was it a published article? And then the measure type. So are we looking at surveys? Are we looking at direct observation and things like that? So just really quickly, the further breakdown of behavior problems and psychological functioning. Again, there was a lot of overlap in these categories. Like I said, these studies were pretty different in how they used language and how they used measures. So the split that we used was behavior problems were measured continuously. So it's a numeric scale, 1 to 10, 1 to 30, 1 to 100, whatever it may be. whereas psychological functioning was categorized diagnostically. So do the siblings or do they not have ADHD, anxiety and depression, etc.? All right, I don't expect you to read all of this, but these are all the studies we included, and I wanted to emphasize the variability. So if you look at the very top, that study at the very top is all the way over at a -2, and this is just the standardized measure. So essentially saying that siblings are 2 times more likely to have negative outcomes than positive outcomes. But then you go all the way down to the bottom and you have several studies that are showing siblings more likely to have positive outcomes than negative outcomes. So even within this meta-analysis, there is a ton of variability. So this idea that the findings are mixed is really shown here in the research. I also wanted to show you how much work my colleague put into putting this table together because he did a really great job. All right, so in general, the results from combining that big long list of studies compared to the various comparison groups, siblings of individuals with autism were more likely to have internalizing problems. They were more likely to have negative beliefs about disability. They had higher levels of ADHD, anxiety and depression, and externalizing behavior symptoms. They had poorer sibling relationships, so less close sibling relationships, and tended to have poorer social skills. Again, this is on average, and on average does not mean for everyone. This is not diagnostic. This is not deterministic. This is not at all saying, oh, every single sibling of someone with autism is going to have a worse sibling relationship than siblings of any other individual. So please keep that in mind. There are so many individual differences, and we're going to talk more about some examples of that later in the presentation. So this is just saying, on average, there seem to be some challenges that siblings of individuals with autism are more likely to face than comparison populations. And that's something we need to look into because we want to identify which siblings are having a harder time and how we can help make that better for them. Another thing to keep in mind, and I want to speak a little bit on this second point, that a lot of the studies that we included in this meta-analysis didn't include information on age, gender, or other potentially meaningful variables. So if you think back to that model that I showed at the beginning, many studies didn't include anything from that model. They just had siblings and a comparison group. We don't know how old these siblings are. We don't know if they are male or female. We don't know what their family situation is. So as a researcher, for clinicians, for families, and for other researchers, it's so important to characterize your sample. Who are you talking about? Where do they live? What are their circumstances? I know we can't gather data on everything. If we asked people to fill out a survey including measures of every single thing in that model, nobody would complete it. We wouldn't have any data at all. But understanding gender, socioeconomic status, these things are very important to help fill in the gaps for our research. And like I said, these studies didn't examine the causes. This is just saying, okay, on average, these differences exist. We still don't know why. So the next study that I'm going to talk about, we tried to look at a little bit of the why. So I hypothesized that stress could potentially be a mechanism for some of these sibling outcomes. So the poorer sibling relationships, the potentially higher rates of anxiety and depression. And I drew this hypothesis from studies of mothers, parents, caregivers of individuals with autism. So many studies have found that mothers and other caregivers report higher levels of stress than comparison groups. But as of a few years ago, nobody had explicitly examined stress in siblings. So we tried to do that, some students and I. So this was just an online survey. Again, this is not the pinnacle of scientific research, but it helped us get some good information. And we took measures from siblings themselves, and specifically these were adolescent siblings. So they were between 12 and 18 years old. And we asked them about overall stress. So this is a general stress measure. It doesn't talk about their siblings. It doesn't talk about their family, just in general, how stressed are you on a daily basis? And then we also asked about specific sources of stress. Everybody knows that high school is stressful, and high school has gotten more stressful as the years have gone by. So how stressful did our participants find academics, extracurriculars, social life, etc.? And then in terms of trying to get at some of these individual differences and actually looking at their situation, we included measures of social support. So how supported do these siblings feel? And then the sibling relationship, as well as a measure of behavior problems for the child with autism. All right, so in general, we ended up with a sample of a little over 200 adolescents, aged 12 to 18. And they were either siblings of individuals with autism, we had 116 of those siblings, or siblings of individuals with Down syndrome. So the siblings, the ones who completed the survey, were nearly statistically identical when it comes to age. The children with Down syndrome, so the brothers or sisters, were a little younger than the brothers or sisters with autism, and we controlled for that in the analyses. All right, so some of our results. So this chart is showing both the levels of behavior problems as well as the subsets of the sibling relationship. So you can see that the children with autism had significantly more behavior problems, significantly higher levels of behavior problems than the children with Down syndrome, as reported by the siblings. And the siblings of individuals with Down syndrome reported slightly more warmth in the sibling relationship than the siblings of individuals with autism. So that reflects what we found in the meta-analysis, that the siblings of individuals with autism don't have, on average, again, quite as close sibling relationships as other populations. But I want you to look at the hostility and conflict for a minute. First of all, those levels are very, very low. We're not seeing a lot of hostility and conflict in the sibling relationship, though again, there's plenty of variability. And those levels are nearly identical between the siblings of individuals with autism and the siblings of individuals with Down syndrome. So even though the ASD SIBs are reporting significantly less warmth in the relationship, they're not reporting any more anger, any more fighting. So that's something else for us to look at in the future. What is it about these relationships? And is that necessarily a bad thing? I'm not saying that siblings shouldn't be close to one another, but is that bothering them? Maybe the way that we have these measures set up doesn't account for individuals with autism. Maybe these siblings think that their relationship is great and they're just fine with it. But the way these questions are set up is asking for things that don't necessarily exist in their relationship with their brother or sister with autism. All right, so moving forward to the more outcome variables. So yes, siblings of individuals with autism reported significantly more stress. Now, this is on a 40-point scale. So you see that siblings of individuals with autism are right at the midpoint. So yeah, they are reporting some stress, not necessarily excessively high levels, but they're still reporting more general stress than the comparison group, the siblings of individuals with Down syndrome. So that's something to look into. But the good news is they are not perceiving any less social support. They report virtually identical levels of social support from their family and their friends, very similar levels of social support from their significant other. So if the social support is identical, what is driving these higher levels of stress. Again, remember, this is general stress. We're not talking about family stress or stress related to the sibling. Now, in looking at the individual stressors, yes, ASD SIBs reported significantly higher levels of stress related to their brother or sister. Down syndrome siblings, interestingly, reported more stress due to extracurricular activities, but neither of these were the highest level of stress. Both groups, the ASD SIBs and the DS SIBs, said that the most stressful thing in their life was academics, which I think is pretty common across many high school students. And again, this higher level of stress due to the brother or sister, or related to the brother or sister for siblings of individuals with autism, this is not a fault finding. This isn't saying it is their brother or sister's fault. This could be the stress of timing. This could be, okay, they have a lot of appointments. They really struggle in school and it's hard for me to see that. So we just asked the question, how much stress do you have related to these different things? So it's not saying my brother or sister as a human being is a highly stressful human being. This is stress related to my brother or sister. Okay, so what we did when we found these differences based on sibling self-report was then we combined them into a regression model. So what regression models let us do, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is it lets us take into account other variables. So we were able to control for age, gender, number of siblings when trying to determine what predicts sibling stress. So yes, for the whole group, both siblings of individuals with autism and siblings of individuals with Down syndrome, the behavior problems of the brother or sister were related to higher stress. Family support was related to lower stress. That's cool. That's something we can use. That's something we can implement. But then this last finding, and I have an illustration on this page, is that group membership was still related to stress. So whether or not you were a sibling of individual with autism or with Down syndrome, that variable was still related to stress, even when we controlled for all of these other things. So what we did was we looked at the interaction. So this model is showing, this figure is showing that for siblings of individuals with Down syndrome, that dotted line on the bottom, if their brother or sister, the child with Down syndrome, has low levels of behavior problems, then that sibling has lower levels of stress. If the individual with Down syndrome has more behavior problems, then the sibling has higher levels of stress. So the line goes up as the behavior problems go up. For the siblings of individuals with autism, that solid line, there's not that relationship. That's a pretty flat line, sort of regardless of behavior problems. So that's showing us that it's not the behavior problems. In this sample, it's not how many temper tantrums the brother or sister with autism throws. So there's something about autism, about being the brother or sister of somebody with autism, that is related to higher levels of stress. And we don't know what that is yet. What is it about the environment, about society, that it seems to be more stressful for siblings of individuals with autism? All right. So for the final study that I'm going to present, and then I'm going to give some examples and leave time for questions, we looked at sibling involvement in interventions for individuals with autism. So this is the living room part. So all right, we talked about sibling involvement in studies, but what about sibling involvement in the family? And I hear this sometimes from parents, like, how much do we want the sibling to be involved? We don't want to force them to it, but we don't want to exclude them. So it's really challenging. So a colleague and I did another review of the literature, just putting it together. What studies are there on strategies and interventions for the child with autism where the sibling was somehow involved. Now, like a lot of things, this isn't a rigorously studied topic, but there's still enough here to tell us a little bit, particularly about how researchers see siblings when it comes to involvement in interventions. Because we want to look at this. We know that siblings are actively involved in their brothers and sisters' lives. So only 17 studies since 1977, and 1977 was the earliest one we were able to find, explicitly described sibling involvement in some kind of intervention, therapy, strategy, something. So there was a lot of variability in this. For a few of the studies, 3 of them specifically, the sibling was a co-recipient of intervention. So they were like a classmate, they were a partner, they were learning alongside the child with autism. And in 14 of these studies, the sibling was a teacher. They were an agent of intervention, either as an instructor, so they were explicitly the one teaching their brother or sister, or they were a model. So they were showing them either live or over video. Some of you may have participated in video modeling interventions. So what did we find in these studies? Well, the majority of them showed that sibling involvement was good for the child with autism. So 15 out of the 17 studies reported improvement in the targeted skills. So somehow having a sibling involved seems to work, and I'm putting quotations, air quotes around that. So this is a good thing. But only 9 of the studies, so just over half, reported any sibling outcomes. And of those sibling outcomes, the vast majority, so 6 out of 9, 2/3 of them, were about how well does the sibling act as a teacher? Are they showing fidelity to the protocol? Are they good teachers? Only 3 of the studies, 3 of these 17 studies, reported anything about non-procedural outcomes. So how does the sibling feel? Is this good for the sibling relationship? Does the sibling like it? So this is an issue that we hear a lot from families, and this review shows that we as researchers have been woefully behind on keeping up with involving siblings as parts of the family and as human beings. Siblings and parents are not tools of intervention. They're not here to just explicitly be teachers and all we measure is how good are they at implementing this intervention. Siblings are parts of the family. Do they want to be involved in these strategies? How much do they want to be involved? So when we talk about sibling involvement, particularly in these strategies and therapies, yes, it seems to be a really good thing for the child with autism. And many siblings, and some of the ones that I've worked with personally, say, yeah, I really like it. It makes me feel like I'm being helpful. I'm spending time with my brother or sister. But we need more measurement of this. What is it like for the sibling? So most siblings, especially older siblings, teach their younger brother or sister to some extent. Teach them how to throw a ball. Teach them how to, I'm trying to think of what I've taught my younger siblings, drive a car. I taught my sister how to parallel park when she was 16. So we all teach our siblings something, but how different is it for siblings of individuals with autism when it's something more structured, like a targeted intervention? And what does that do? Is it mutually beneficial? Is this something that's going to benefit the entire family? And then this last point is super important. Every single one of these 17 studies was only done once. Not a single one has been replicated in the literature. And intervention studies, even more so than survey studies, tend to have very small sample sizes. I mean, some of these only had 3 to 5 families, and that's great, that's informative. We appreciate the family's involvement, but we have no idea if these types of interventions, that have sibling involvement are going to work the same way for other families and in other settings. So replication is absolutely key, and unfortunately, it does not happen nearly as often as we would like it to as researchers. All right, so that's some of the research. So we started out very broad, looking at the meta-analysis, the collection of all the studies. We talked a little bit about stress as a potential mediator of some of these outcomes. And then we talked about sibling involvement. But now I'm going to move on to giving some examples and just a few tips, and then I'll open it up for questions. So these are some stories of families that I have worked with. Now, some of them might reflect the data and the results that I've shared so far, and some of them are going to be a little different. So the first one was a buddy of mine from my postdoc up in Michigan. And I worked with various families trying to replicate one of these sibling-mediated interventions. And this particular family, the child with autism was 9 and his younger brother was 7. And the 9-year-old was not my biggest fan. One time I knocked on the door and he opened it and just said, "No." Okay, so we're not hanging out today, no big deal. His younger brother at that point said, "You're still going to hang out with me, right?" And it was one little question, but this is potentially reflective of the idea that sometimes siblings of individuals with autism get very used to things not being about them. So for this family, and this was a great family, I loved working with them, they were used to, and the younger brother was used to, everybody who comes to the house was there for his big brother. It was a therapist, it was a doctor, it was somebody that was there to do something with his big brother, not somebody that was there to do something with him. So as part of this study, this attempted replication, I worked really hard to make sure that I was involving both siblings. And even if the child with autism didn't want to participate, which obviously sometimes they don't, I would still go through the procedures and play the game with the sibling. So that's something to keep in mind, that yes, there are plenty of necessities, that yes, it's going to be about the child with autism. There are therapy appointments, there are meetings with teachers, whatever it may be, but try to be cognizant of how you're involving the siblings if they want to be involved. And this is on every level. So as clinicians, as researchers, how are we involving the siblings? Or are we sort of too laser focused on the child with autism to the exclusion of the sibling? Now, this second example, this was from an interview study that I did, and I interviewed any child in the family who was willing to be interviewed. And this happened to be a young man who had a brother without autism and then a sister with autism. And in describing their family, he said, "The way our family functions is more tailored to her." So I need to point out that in addition to a diagnosis of autism, this older sister also had a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, and I believe depression as well. So it's not just autism. Again, we're not saying that this is a fault thing, but this is a description of something that's called family accommodation. And even if you've never heard that phrase before, you've probably experienced it. This is where things implicitly or explicitly just sort of become arranged to what's going to make the child with autism the most comfortable. So that's what this brother was saying, that our family is more tailored to her. I am not saying that this is a bad thing. We all tailor the way we act depending on who we're around. But again, think of the sort of general balance of things. Like, what is the cost benefit analysis of changing behaviors to make one child happy versus another? Sometimes it might be just fine. Like, okay, we're not doing this. We're not eating this for dinner. We are doing this. We're watching this video for the 57th time today. Not that that's unique to autism. I do it with my nieces and nephews all the time. But keep in mind, what are you asking from every other member of the family? Now, this last example was from a mother, and the younger child, who was 5 or 6 at the time of the interview, had autism, and the older son was 10. And the mom very adamantly said, we want his life to be as normal as possible. I understand that. I empathize with that. I really do. But there's only so much you can do. Again, society is not set up for people with autism, and kids know that. They can see, these siblings can see, and the children with autism can see that their lives are different. Everybody's lives are different, but when you have a child with autism, there tend to be some very obvious examples of how their life is different in ways that maybe society doesn't expect or isn't used to. So striving for this normal life can be a bit of a moot point to some extent. So your lives are different in some ways, can be different, and trying to prevent the siblings from seeing that and from living that can actually end up making it more challenging for the siblings. So just a few general tips, and then we'll get to questions. This first one, talking, relates to that last example that I gave. Don't assume that you know what siblings want. And I know talking is easier said than done, particularly perhaps with adolescent siblings. But again, don't assume. I'll hear from parents like, oh, we want them to be normal. We don't want them to be involved in all of this. Well, maybe the siblings want to be involved. Maybe they want to participate in that part of family life, or maybe they don't, or maybe they want to be involved sometimes, but not others. So really establishing this kind of communication from a very young age is going to be beneficial throughout the life course. With that in mind, talk about planning ahead. One of the biggest issues that families face is, all right, what's going to happen when the child graduates from high school? What's going to happen when the parents are no longer able to care for the individual with autism in whatever capacity that may be? Having these conversations early so you know what to expect can help make any transition less challenging. And then this last one may seem kind of obvious and cliched, but definitely take care of yourself. Because if parents aren't taking care of themselves, then they are more at risk for putting some of that burden on the siblings. And this is called parent-focused parentification. So it's not having the sibling care for their brother or sister, it's having the sibling care for the parent. And that could be physically caring for them, making sure they eat dinner, making sure the laundry's done, but it can also be emotional care, sort of listening to the parent and the challenges that they go through. And this kind of parent-focused parentification can be very challenging, especially on young siblings. So making sure you're taking care of yourself, that you have a support system, is really going to be beneficial for the entire family. That is all I have. I wanted to make sure to thank all of my amazing collaborators and thank you all for listening. So now I'm going to open it up for questions, and I see some questions here. So let's see, has the stress of typical adolescence been measured, and how does that compare to the stress levels of ASD/DS siblings? That is an excellent question. And I'm going to start out by saying we tried to get a sample of siblings of individuals without any disabilities. And it just, there's no sort of central, typically developing sibling database. You can reach out to autism support groups, Down syndrome support groups, and they can talk to their families. There's nothing like that for, again, I'm using air quotes here, typical families. So in looking at adolescent stress, we know that general academic stress has increased over the past few decades. High school students now are far more stressed than students were a generation or two ago. But in terms of that specific measure, the measure that we used and how that compares, we don't actually have that data because most of the original findings or most of the research findings are looking at a specifically targeted group, not just a general population. So we know from the meta-analysis that siblings of individuals with autism don't have any lower levels of adjustment than comparison groups, but we don't know that answer for especially the specific measure of stress that we used. So it's a really good question, and that was a very long-winded way of saying we don't know. All right, specific Q&As. 14-year-old twin boys, any services or programs that involve siblings who live 10 minutes north of Boston. Okay, so the first example that I'm going to give you is, and let me see if I can pull it up, is the Sibling Support Network. And this is an online resource. There you go, the Sibling Leadership Network. It's siblingsupport.org. So this is not specific to siblings of individuals with autism, but it's siblings of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in general. So this is going to be a good online resource. And we all know that the internet can be a very dangerous and weird place, but it's very helpful for these kind of support groups for individuals that might not live in urban areas. Now, 10 minutes north of Boston, something that the Sibling Leadership Network will be able to tell you is if there are actual SIB shops in your area, and there should be. Gail Orsmond is at Boston University, and she's done a lot of good work on siblings. So I want to say that Boston University and probably some other organizations around the Boston metro area have SIB shops. And SIB shops are monthly or quarterly in-person support group meetings for siblings of individuals with disabilities. And they have activities, they have share sessions. So by looking at the Sibling Leadership Network, you should be able to find both those in-person resources, but then also an online community that hopefully your son can take advantage of. So then the next question is, SIB shops are a popular intervention, and is there research supporting its efficacy? I love that you use the word efficacy because the answer to that is no. There is research on, do siblings like SIB shops? Do the SIB shops meet the proposed SIB shop goals? Yes, but the proposed SIB shop goals are, I met other siblings that are like me. I enjoyed being there. I liked the people that I met. There's nothing really examining the impact of SIB shops on stress levels, on sibling relationships, on coping, anything like that. So again, this is not to say they are not a really good thing. SIB shops, I love them as a resource. I love the opportunity. I love, again, like the first questioner asked, just providing siblings with peers, knowing that they're not the only one. So that's a good thing. But in terms of efficacy and how it changes or affects actual psychosocial outcomes, we don't have this kind of information. So we know that siblings like them, we know that parents like them, but we don't know if they are contributing to any actual social or relational changes. The last question that I see here is, what are the stress levels for siblings whose sibling with autism was not diagnosed at a young age? That's a great question. Again, we don't know. This is, there's so much about siblings that we don't know. Anecdotally, what I have heard from individuals, siblings, but then also other individuals in the lives of people with autism who were diagnosed maybe at a later age, especially in adulthood, is a sense of relief in that, oh, that's it. That makes sense. Here's an explanation. My brother or sister, my friend, my spouse, whoever has been really confused for a long time. They don't understand why they don't see the world in the same way everybody else does. And then they get an autism diagnosis. And it's like, oh, yes, this makes sense. Now there is a community. Now there are answers online, in person, working with clinicians. So they're really interesting cases because on one hand, individuals with autism who are diagnosed at a later age still are confronted by a lot of the challenges and barriers, but they don't have the label. And we know that labels can certainly help people get appropriate services, but they can also be hindrances in, as soon as you hear somebody has autism, their teachers, their clinicians, whoever gets a mental image of what that person can and can't do. For individuals who are diagnosed at a later age, they don't have that label, so they don't necessarily have those assumptions from people around them. And as siblings, getting back to the original question, then they don't have that label that, my brother or sister has autism, this is what that means. This is what culture says that means. This is what, my personal view says that means. So the diagnosis of autism does have an impact on the sibling relationship, but we haven't measured that yet, especially related to stress levels. All right, those are all of the questions that I see. Are there any others? Vincent, is there anything else that I can do? Feel free to email me if you have other questions. I really appreciate you all listening, but yeah, let me know if there's anything else that I can answer in these last few minutes.
Hi, Carolyn. I don't have any other questions that came in through another route, but
Okay.
We can maybe just wait another minute or so.
Okay.
And then if nothing comes through, we could wrap things up.
Awesome. Well, I do really appreciate you all listening. And I know a lot of people's questions are going to be, what can help my family? And that, unfortunately, still to this day depends on where you live and what are the resources around you. So I would recommend looking at these online opportunities. So we have a last question. How can we as parents relieve the stress of siblings? That is a great question. So as parents, talk to the siblings, see what they want, and see what are their sources of stress. Now, they're not always going to know. We don't always know what's stressing us out. But if you talk to the siblings, and if you think that can help you manage your own assumptions. So if you think, their sibling is really annoying them, I'm going to try to make sure that they don't have to deal with their brother or sister with autism. And then you talk to the sibling and they say, actually, I don't feel like I understand them and I want to get to know them better and I don't know how. Okay, then you can help guide them toward these resources, toward these blogs, these forums, these support groups, and getting ideas from other siblings. So talking to them, finding out what they specifically want, is going to help relieve the stress. And then also acknowledging that they have stress from other sources of life. Remember that, yes, siblings of individuals with autism reported higher levels of stress related to their brother or sister than the siblings of individuals with Down syndrome. But overall, it was academics that was the biggest source of stress. So helping them manage this general stress is going to help overall. So don't assume that everything's always about their brother or sister with autism, because it's not going to be. There are going to be plenty of other aspects of their lives, and that in and of itself, helping them realize that they can and should have lives beyond their family, as all of us do, is going to help them form these support groups and these social support relationships that we find to be beneficial. So I apologize if that sounds overly simplistic, but keeping open lines of communication and finding what the sibling wants is going to be very helpful. But then also introducing them to these support networks, and they're everywhere. Reddit has a subreddit for siblings of individuals with disabilities where these siblings can share these things. So peer groups, talking, finding out what the sibling themselves wants are all going to be very helpful things.
Okay, thank you so much. I did see one other comment come in through chat asking about psychologists or family consultants in St. Louis. So I do know that the autism response team at Autism Speaks can sometimes refer various professionals nationwide. So they have a call center. So you can always get in touch with them and they might be able to connect you to someone. Carolyn, do you have any other resources if people are looking for specialists or
yes,
don't know where to turn?
Yeah, so to provide support for a typical sibling, I would recommend looking at universities. So Washington University in St. Louis, SLU down there, looking at their programs. So I think I'm pretty sure WashU has a really good what's the word I'm looking for? A social. Anyway, they have really good programs in human behavioral studies. So looking at maybe language programs, developmental or clinical psychology programs, they would be the ones that sort of house not only this research, but then the support for individuals and families of individuals with autism. Social work, that's the word I'm looking for. WashU has a really good social work program, and I know they have some disability support related to that program.
Okay. All right. So thank you again so much for sharing your research and all your knowledge with everyone today. We really appreciate